Just a huge welcome to all of you, and in particular to Professor Duncan MacLennan, who's joining us today to launch our Thriving Local series of events. Huge thanks for getting involved. There's going to be more, and it's launched on the back of a piece of work we've started around Thriving Local, which is an idea that's yours if you want to use it as much as anything else. There is a paper to connect with this, but the most important thing is, what does it mean to thrive locally in Edinburgh? So just a wee bit of housekeeping again is just to say, we will be recording this meeting. We really hope to make space for questions, lots of questions, either in the chat or by raising your hand using the electronic function in Zoom, but we'll also watch for hands for those who cannot do that. Please keep your microphones on mute, that would be fantastic. So welcome to you all. Now, Professor Duncan MacLennan has written a report that the work has been done since the start of COVID. And for me, it really rang through. And that's why we asked him along today in terms of Thriving Local. So Duncan is an applied economist with interests in cities, neighbourhoods, infrastructure and housing. Today is his last day as Professor of Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. So we're very honoured that we've got his support for his last gig should be our kickoff for the beginning of our series. But Duncan also works at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and has worked internationally looking at housing in places such as China. He's looked at innovations in places like Ireland and also in Canada itself, where he's spending time. What is the David Hume Institute? It is an independent think tank who commissioned the report. And I thought they're a very interesting group. I'd only recently come across. We've got Susan with us today from the David Hume Institute. And it's an organisation that listens to a wide range of sources. And I couldn't think of a wider group here today in terms of your interests in the room, but specifically, from those who were seldom heard, from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, different ages, abilities and genders. And the truth springs from arguments among friends. Well, let's kick one of those off today. And just specifically about this report, the central concern of the report was actually to really think about place, the possibility for and the problems of place in public policy making. And I suppose for me, this really rang through when I joined Duncan with a small group, talking to a much larger room, and I think thousands of people involved in your work, Duncan, to put this report together, looking at place last year. And of course, COVID has been a terrible shock for all of us here and for our communities. It's been a shock for our economy, for our food systems. But meanwhile, the place we're in became a place where we could walk, where maybe we were based for our work, although not necessarily, but the resources and the people around us became incredibly important for us. And certainly never before have we realised the importance of place. So I'm going to shut up at this stage and hand over to Duncan and say, tell us more about, a little bit about you to start off. It's your last day in Glasgow, and specifically about this report, and tell us some of your key findings and thoughts from that. Over to Duncan.
Thanks very much, Bridie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually speaking from territory or land traditionally held by the Mi'kmaq people in southern Nova Scotia. It was taken from them in the early 1750s when this village, Kingsburg, was established by General Cornwallis. And I have great sympathy with the Mi'kmaq, not least because General Cornwallis practiced these arts by putting to death Jacobite rebels after the Battle of Culloden. So it's interesting how histories converge in different ways. But also in terms of histories, I'm delighted to see Jane Cullingworth from Glasgow in the background of the cloisters. Jane will be delighted to know that I'm actually retiring from Glasgow, because we had to share a desk in Policy Scotland. Now you'll get the whole desk to yourself, Jane. And that's a big gain in territory that you don't often get in a university. But I've been working a long time in Glasgow and in other places. I spent 10 years working in government in Scotland, in Canada and Australia, mainly on issues about cities and housing and neighbourhoods. But I decided that it's about time I stopped having a job and just did what I wanted, which will include still working and writing and thinking about housing and neighbourhoods. I've been stuck in Canada, and until about a month ago, I hadn't had my second Pfizer injection. But I now have, and I'm coming home to Edinburgh in about 3 weeks' time. So I'm excited at the prospect of getting back to Scotland. So maybe we can follow up some things there. That's enough about me, but let me tell you about this report. And thank you, Bridie and Yvonne, for asking me to talk today. I think that your concern is the thriving local. And I want to emphasise some of the key points from the David Hume report, the Scotland, a Better Places. And I see Susan Murray has circulated it. My role was to bring together the views of the people that participated in the webinars. And there were about 600 or 700 people. And in the wider project, there were 2,000 or 3,000 people. So that I tried to synthesize these in a reasonably even-handed, but of course it always ends up that whoever is holding the pen shapes the narrative. So no doubt some of my own prejudices filtered in, but I'll try and keep that to a minimum. The intention of the project was to, the general project was to understand how Scotland can move faster to become more prosperous, sustainable, inclusive and fair. So a pretty demanding set of goals to look at. And the report itself looks at rural areas, towns and city regions. It looks at all kinds of places, if you like. But in this discussion today, I thought it was appropriate to focus on, I would say, the city region level, the city region scale. But the city regions, I think, in terms of strategic decision taking, and I think potentially in governance, but certainly in the way in which they function, it's most effective to think about them as two scales. There is the city region scale at which a lot of economic life, labour markets, housing markets, transport systems, some big environmental systems all operate at that scale. But also there's a second scale, which is the neighbourhood and the community, at which many of the social interactions, many of the things round about our social lives, our residential lives, how we tie together our lives happen at these more localised scales. And it is rather unfortunate that neither of these scales conforms to our main structure of government, i.e. local authorities. And I'll come back to that, because a lot of our problem in dealing with issues about place is the mismatch between the functional spaces that we live in, neighbourhoods and metropolitan economies, in the case of the cities, as opposed to local authorities which divide the territory and responsibilities. So I think that's an important issue to come back to, and how we move towards more thriving places. I want to just make some introductory remarks about how I think it's important to see place and how we think about place, because I don't think there's a very coherent approach to thinking about places in communities within policymaking, or nor indeed within academia. And that's particularly true when one talks about the economic dimensions of policies. So I want to make some of these comments, get them out of the way, and then focus on specifically communities in that metropolitan context. The remarks I make, I actually think that place-based policy and renewal policy, it's got a really long tradition in Scotland. It's actually got quite a rich tradition. And if we look at, particularly the west of Scotland, has a higher density of community-based organisations that actually have assets than any other place in the UK. And I observe slightly wryly that the discovery of community wealth as an idea is about 40 years behind the discussion that took place about community-based housing associations in Glasgow. But I'll come back to that point later on. So that I think that the remarks I made about about government policy, I intend them in the spirit, if you like, as a kind of critical friend. I think that it'd be good for the Scottish Government to listen to the ideas that come from people. I don't just mean me. I mean, these are ideas from a large range of people. They're not intended in a hostile fashion. They are about contributing ideas for debate, discussion, sifting in the context of building forward better. I don't talk about building back because we don't want to go back to where we've been, but we want to build forward and build different. And I think at a very general level, the times in which we're operating, given the context of COVID, but before that, had changed, and notions of economic policies had begun to change. The ideas that shaped the Washington consensus, in which community was a residual and place-based policies were just palliative, they were just simply for fixing up the worst places, and they were simply an act of redistribution. I think that thinking has begun to change within economic policy making. People take the issue of inclusion seriously. What does inclusive growth mean in terms of the way we look at benefits of redistribution, about how that shapes lives, how it shapes for the long term? You actually have to start thinking about neighbourhood and community in a different way. And for people who are doing impact and assessment work and having to deal with things like the government's Green Book or the Magenta Book, I think their game is up in some senses, and they need to be radically rewritten to actually, if you say community wealth is important, if you say inclusion is important, if you say sustainable development is important, you're going to have to rewrite the rules of the game that were written for an economic policy consensus that actually ignored these issues. So that at a high level, we've got to start thinking about how we push back in terms of these ideas in building better from below. I also think it's important in terms of politics, and I'm not a political scientist, but whether one looks at left behind communities of a spatial nature or a particular sectional interest or whatever, I think that the detach now of so many people from politics that appears to operate either at a parliament level or at an internet level that has little connection with the communities in which people live. I think we really need to begin to think about how democracy actually works at community scales. Not just voice, but democracy in the sense of effective delivery. So whilst we're talking about, if you like, small scales, they're really big issues. These are big issues, and they will define how effectively Scotland builds forward for the future. The big debates when it gets to independence, deficits, debts, the currency, can we join Europe? For a lot of people, it will be how well placed, how will our communities be involved, how will engagement take place, what are the rules of the game, how does Edinburgh, in a sense, embrace the parts of Edinburgh but the other communities within Scotland as a whole. So that's a very big picture, and I'll just stick that over there, but it is one of the reasons why I think this issue is particularly important. So let's then look at some of the issues about place. Well, as I said, I think place has been quite a recurrent theme in Scottish Government decision-taking and thinking of late. We've had inclusive growth, talking about place a bit. We've had just transition, talks about place. Infrastructure Commission talks about place. Community wealth talks about place. 20-minute cities or neighbourhoods talk about place. And they all talk about it in different ways. None of it is joined up and connected. And to my way of thinking, having worked in government 20 years ago, and even as recently as 12 years ago, the ideas have been relatively undigested before they've, in a sense, been put out for discussion, and we can come back to that. But I welcome these different ideas, but they lack a clear overall approach. And I think that sometimes there's almost a babble of ideas about how to change. And given that not just communities, but local authorities are really under-resourced after the last 10, 15 years of stripping out any thinking capacity for the voluntary sector, for community groups, for indeed local authorities have hardly any thinking capacity left within them to deal with these ideas. I think that much more clarity and digestion of these ideas and debate and discussion about them is required before they're up and running as something that people are claiming resources for or whatever. In other words, I think it's really important that we have this great, it's really odd to have an academic say there's too many ideas. For us, there's never enough ideas, especially our own. But what I'm saying is there are too many unsorted ideas here. And I think that it's really important that we have to begin to get to grips with them when we think about place. So if place policy is to be more than a fashion, what does it have to be? Well, the first is we have to stop the 10-year recurrent decade cycle of people saying, no, it's not place policy, it's people policy, or people versus place. It's particular people in particular kinds of places, that people and place always have to be viewed together. There's no validity in the place versus people policy argument. We will see the people versus place policy argument re-emerge, I suspect, within the levelling up debate within the next 2 years. But it's really important that we beat that back. We have to think of place really. When you think of it, it's the locality, it's a domain, it's a territory in which we undertake our recurrent daily activities of residing, just living in our homes, socialising, being in the neighbourhood, shopping, playing, working. It's the core of the geography of our daily lives. That's what place is. It's the core of the geography of our daily lives. And it means in that context, proximity to services, proximity to public and private services, but proximity to infrastructure, but also proximity to each other. So all these interactions are taking place at that level, and they define whether or not the place is effective for us and also for the other people that live within it. It's also the locality in which we use public infrastructures most, and also where services are delivered. And we combine these services, these infrastructures, the private things we do, our own time, these resources to deliver what we need. In other words, at community level, we have an understanding, we have a nuance, we have an information that people who are planners can't possibly have that. They just don't have the knowledge. It's an impossibility in the system unless you have some coherent collective understanding at community-based level. So in other words, articulating the case for strong community is about saying, how do we integrate lives better for people? Right? How do we integrate lives better for people? And what difference is that going to make? And it also says that thinking about place is for all kinds of communities. It's not just for poor people. Place policy is not just a palliative policy for places that have failed or services that have failed or people that are having a hard time. Place policy is also about constructing effectively in environmental terms and social terms. Some of our more affluent suburban communities are really deficient in some of the what you would think place-based attributes that would make them work really effectively. So that place policy then, if we think, obviously redistribution is going to be an important part of this, but it's something that's for all of us. And that's why I say in terms of these guidance manuals and the green books and the magenta book, I think about 25 years ago, I wrote some of the advice about evaluating area projects for the Treasury Green Book. That was a long time ago. And I think that these things are now being completely left behind by the policy agendas that are there. And I think the local authority and the voluntary sector should really attack these Bibles, if you like, for decision taking, because there's a disjuncture between what governments say they espouse and the technical apparatus they're now using to evaluate propositions. So have a go and see where you get to. I don't like inconsistency, unless it's me. So going beyond that, so we're focusing on the local. But in focusing on the local, it's really important not to have debates that set urban against rural, town versus city. And there's always been a tendency to do that in place policy in Scotland. But the focus has to be, in our case, it's on the local, it's on the community. But when we do that, we always have to focus, but also recognise the connection to wider systems, whether it's a city, whether it's the nation, whether it's international. Neighbourhoods don't always communicate with the wider world through their city, nor indeed their nation. There's direct contact, individual to individual contacts, as we're doing now, across national spaces. So thinking about the connections between localities and the wider world is really important. And I don't think neighbourhoods generally, nor community groups, are outward enough thinking about how they use internet and others to connect with, to be involved with the global as well as the national and local. So I think there are some issues around about that. But in that context, the places that we use don't have hard boundaries. The boundaries of officialdom are hard boundaries, i.e. of administrative boundaries. But the boundaries of our neighbourhoods, the way we use, will differ from people within the same neighbourhood, but they're not hard boundaries. They're gradations that go away. And similarly, the metropolitan economies. So what we've got to think about is, how do we align that? How do we have a coherent sense of the geography of the actions that we have to make sense of these complexities we're trying to bring together? And I'm suggesting that the geography we have at the moment between the Scottish Government and local government does not actually fit the modern purpose. It does not fit the modern purpose of what we're trying to do. So the critical question then becomes how we develop governance arrangements. You don't want to be changing the structures of government all the time. Can you create governance arrangements? Can you create partnerships? How do you allocate resource autonomies? How do you allocate choices to different levels within the system? And I think that we've skirted around these issues in relation to place and locality in Scotland for quite a long time. So I think that most of the big economic issues that need to be dealt with, I mean, I don't disapprove of community wealth as a policy tool that can be important in creating additional local jobs. But you can't run an economy by deciding you're going to take in your own washing. You've got to think about productivity. You've got to think about trade. You've got to think not about closing down links to the wider world. You've actually got to improve your effectiveness and increase your capacity. I mean, that's still the world we operate in. But within that, as a local policy tool, but as a philosophical approach about how to run a metropolitan economy, I just think Neil McEnroe, I think the community wealth approach is wrong. So happy to have that debate. As you can see, I'm not ambiguous. I think it is wrong. It's right as a local instrument and wrong as a big policy strategy. So what are the broad principles that we can say of Scotland and the things that need to change? And I'll try and do this a bit more concisely. First of all, I think Scottish Government have taken on all the issues about place principles. They've tried to think about a whole range of things. But what we have at the moment in terms of policy approaches to place is we have a real multiplicity of approaches that, in a sense, as I made the point earlier, they're not well integrated. And at the same time, we now have the consequence of Brexit in regional policy, which I think was important in supporting voluntary and other groups through the European Union version of regional policy, but which the Scottish Government adopted. Control over that has now been taken back to Westminster. I'm not at all clear who the losers are going to be, but I suspect it may be less conventional projects that will actually be squeezed out by that line of thinking. So I think there's a real danger in place policy at the moment until the Scottish Government and the UK Government have a much more harmonious relationship about how they deliver across the different levels, from nation to Scotland to city region to localities, then we have a difficulty arising that's not being addressed. So policy, which people have tried to coordinate, like having the city deals was to coordinate Scottish Government and Westminster policy, is now being discoordinated by the instruments of the levelling up agenda, and I think that you will have to watch out for that as we go forward. Coming specifically to the Scottish context, I think the Scottish Government have made a great error in not aligning all this suite of place-based initiatives to their national performance framework. I mean, we have a national performance framework, which I think is quite effective, which needed to be cascaded down and amended to metropolitan and indeed neighbourhood scales. You know, what's good performance at neighbourhood scale? I think that's important, and different notions of performance from different kinds of neighbourhoods. But none of the discussion we're having at the moment is linked into that. And I think that if the Scottish Government were to actually think about its place policy in the context of its national performance framework, suitably amended, we might have a much more coherent discussion, and we might have a much more coherent formulation and indeed evaluation of policy when things actually hit the ground. At the moment, I think the confusion of ideas leads to huge implementation gap between ideas and progress on the ground. And I think it is a huge implementation gap. I think the third thing I want to say on policy is, I think there's been a failure since really the Parliament started to continue the process of devolution downwards within Scotland, so that there was real bottom-up capacity. If you look at the UK, if you look at Scotland, it's an extraordinarily centralised system of government. Local governments spend a lower proportion of GNP than in most other countries, apart from a few former Soviet bloc countries. The size of local authorities is huge by European standards. I mean, the average size of a local authority in Scotland is 70,000 people. In Denmark, it's about 7,000 or 8,000 people. So a different conception of local authority. And also, on top of that, really acute central controls on government expenditure and on tax policy. There's no real freedom in tax policy for localities in Scotland, so there's no local choice. And in that context, I think that has been a real mistake on the part of all the parties. And it really requires, if we had royal commissions, we should have had a royal commission, because nobody will take the political initiative to be seen to be reforming the tax system, because it'll lose them votes when all the others say, oh, no, we won't do it. So Scottish politicians collectively were to be less cowardly about this, and I mean the opposition parties as well as the government party. We could begin to sort a more effective and efficient tax system. And it has to be not just about reforming the council tax, but it's also about land tax. It's also about building transaction tax. All these things have been reformed in other places in other countries. The 2 Australian states have recently replaced the equivalent of stamp duty or building and land and building transaction tax with a land tax to try and give it a more even ground. What about all the environmental charges and taxes that localities could implement to actually deal with some of the environmental issues that are occurring, even at very local scales, congestion issues, even within particular kinds of neighbourhoods? We don't do that. In Scotland, we identify a problem and say, oh, well, let's either regulate it or let's get the Scottish Government to spend money on it, or somebody else to spend money on it. We don't actually think about how we use fiscal instruments to actually deliver better outcomes and potentially more effective resources for communities. Given the importance of environmental issues, there are potential local, very local tax bases that could have a credible case for existence. That was not the case when government was not involved in these particular issues. So I do think that as a background to change for communities, we really need to see this beginning to shift, because when you look at it, particularly for the last decade, local authorities have squeezed out a lot of voluntary activity because they've been squeezed to concentrate on their core local authority services. Residual budgets after that, which have always been important in community and voluntary sectors, are actually significantly reduced. And at the same time, some of the programmes that supported communities have not held up. I exempt the affordable housing programme from that criticism, although in the report I say I think it should be running at double the level it presently is if we're going to make progress. But at least the Scottish Government have held up that programme. So that we have this very centralised system of resources, which other countries don't necessarily adhere to this, that do well. In the Scandinavian countries, a lot of continental Europe, they have much smaller local authorities. So the voice of local people is heard by local politicians, and they have autonomies in terms of tax revenues or even control of particular council resources. I do think you do need to begin to change on that. What in the context of local authorities we do have, I still think that there has been imagination about how to change services, but no delivery. I mean, 26 years after the Macintosh report, which talked about community councils as being important, community councils are very variable in their existence and impact. And if they were ever seen to have been as a pillar for community participation and interface with representative democracy, which I think was what was envisaged, that's not happened. Why hasn't that happened? Why doesn't government care enough to fix it, if in fact there are issues around about that? So I think that's important. But equally, the Christie Review of Local Government Service Provision hasn't been implemented either. And provision of local government services in Scotland and metropolitan areas and change has lagged behind some of the big metropolitan areas in England in recent years, who have been much more radical about how they've reorganised the geography of service provision. So all of that, these are backgrounds to then engaging with communities. Well, I said earlier, I think that if you're managing a metropolitan area or even a big city, you have to think at two scales, the aggregate scales and communities and neighbourhoods. I was Donald Dure's special advisor in the Scottish Parliament. In fact, I've worked for his two successors for a while as well. And when community planning came up as an area for policy making, Wendy Alexander took the lead on it, and she was very enthusiastic about it. And her view of what community planning was that it would bring together local authorities and government, but more to the point, it would bring together local authorities with all the local initiatives that there were, all the place-based initiatives, the neighbourhood schemes, the community renewal schemes. In other words, there should be representation from these people on the community council and on the community planning board. It was as much as a discussion between the city and its communities, rather than the city than the bureaucracies and quangos of national government. Well, I left Scotland. That was still current as an idea in 2003. I left Scotland in 2003 for 10 years, and when I came back, it had largely disappeared. I think that community planning became a discussion between the bureaucracies about how they might integrate for a particular local authority area. And the community level and the voluntary level within that had largely disappeared. Now, I think that that can be reconstructed, but maybe what one now does is aim at the regional partnership level, because that's where a lot of the big economic conversations about linking up are being made. And communities should not be left just to deal with the social, but actually have a voice on the community relevant economic instruments like community wells that are in play. So in that context, with local authorities themselves too small to deal with the big strategic issues and too large to deal with community issues, I think rebuilding a different governance partnership is going to be quite important, but also, of course, incredibly different. So these things can change. I would refer you to the Royal Commission on Local Government for Auckland in New Zealand, which 10 years ago, it used to be there were, I think, 8 local authorities within the Auckland metropolitan area who had all the control over services and no strategic influence. And Auckland Regional Council, which was simply a planning authority and was seen as holding back everyone's growth. But all the services were needing to be distributed at different levels. They flipped their system over so that all the control over services, which were delivered by more decentralized agents, were done from the city region level, with in fact local government being essentially replaced by, I think, about 30 local partnership areas where people had budgets to deal with community issues, but also, and 10 years on, I think the system is bedded down reasonably well. That's just an example. There are many others. But
thank you. Just to say thank you. You have arrived at exactly a point that I think is going to be a point which is of interest to many here in the room, about how you devolve those budgets and how you begin to get those communities, to get those voices. Can I just say thank you? But I mean, just to say what a tour de force of actually conveying the conclusions of the conversations you've been having with many people in recent months. I went to 2 of your events last year and talked to many folk in the room, from community organisations to universities and government and to local authorities. So you've talked, I think, to over 4,000 people, Susan tells us in the chat, have been reached through that. And what a fascinating example to hear that from Auckland. I hope you don't mind me saying, Duncan, that actually I think one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you was one of the key expressions in your report was about delivering place creativity. And I think you've really emphasised that is actually where, in different structurally, we need to have things changed that deliver place creativity, and places as creative ecosystems as well, I think is really powerful. And do you mind me asking a bit about really one theme within that, because I think you see place as a route to counter sort of political disengagement. And I suppose one of the things we've done at EVOC quite quickly is reach out to the community councils in Edinburgh. Steve, who chairs the community councils, couldn't be here today, but do we ignore political engagement at our peril? And how are our local community organisations in Edinburgh, many people here today represent those, are we linking in with our community councils to counter political disengagement in all sorts of ways? So I'm just curious about that. This whole theme is in the report about this disengagement of our local communities that are left behind.
Bridie, sorry going on for so long and on the other things. I think that the political disengagement, I think, has been less obvious in Scotland to date than in other contexts, because people who felt left behind by the conventional politics had an out by saying, we're going to support Scottish independence. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence to that effect, that after 2010, say, I think that became a significant issue. But the point then becomes, you have to engage people and you have to move on. And that's why I'm saying it's really important, it's important for all the parties to have a much more coherent understanding of how they will talk to and listen to community. Because otherwise, if people become disaffected by the nationalist cause, where do they go?
Yes.
They won't necessarily go back to politics as was before, but we then have the difficulties that we've seen in some communities in England, very obviously, which are now being reworked in different ways. So I think that engagement is really important. I'd also wanted to say that I do think that support for communities, I'm biased in this because I spent 9 years on the board of Scottish Homes, which was succeeded by Community Scotland. But I actually think we do need an agency with expertise that does actually help communities in a much more consistent fashion. And it's not just about housing, but it's about all these other things that cohere. It's community wealth building. It's about community land where community land's the issue. It's about community housing too, and community schools even. I do think we need some capacity to actually make that work again.
Maybe just to acknowledge that is one of the recommendations in the report, is for a public body with expertise in housing, but also in communities. And I suppose it's something we're really interested in EVOC, is how we can help build capacity in organisations to really be trained and to listen to the community voice, and for those who are doing that well, to share that practice with each other. How we can get, in my role as incoming chief executive, Duncan, I've been talking about turning the pyramid upside down. EVOC's here, and we're there to support the communities and the community organisations to come forward. And it's really interesting how you talk about the community planning structure. For us, that's the Edinburgh Partnership, and EVOC has the deputy chair role there. So for me, this report feels like a bit of a crossroads. One of the key things we can put before them about that sense of the place ecosystem and the local ecosystem. And it's interesting how you connected with housing too. So just want to acknowledge that's one of the key themes is coming through in the chat, is actually about housing and that sort of community, the sort of community resilience and creation, stimulating communities that are natural and are cohesive as part of our journey. And I'm just really, I'm interested in the fact that I suppose in these other countries, we're seeing some of that devolution of power also helping that to happen. So I'm curious, what would you do differently, or what would you do more of if you were running a community organisation in Edinburgh at this point, considering those structural changes are maybe in the hands of others, through voting and through these mechanisms, we can begin to talk about it. What would you do differently if you're in a community organisation right now in Edinburgh, or do more of in the light of the challenges ahead to create more of a sense of focus on place?
Well, I think that there are community organisations that have assets, and there are community organisations that don't have assets. I think that a really important thing for community organisations is not to be cut down to a single function, because I'm saying the nature of place, the nature of community, is that there are critical joins that need to be made, and it's the community that makes them. Therefore, they have to have governance arrangements and actually institutions that operate, or non-profits that operate, that will do more than one thing. I think that the non-profits that I've seen operating in the Canadian context, and you can also see them in Australia, that started off from, the Australian one started off from a UK or even a Scottish-like model, and they evolved very quickly to doing a range of different things. And that has actually helped, particularly when they're in metropolitan areas, because one thing that goes up is the value of the property, and the value of the property that's owned by community entities also increases. And the ability to leverage that and use private money to support the public purpose is open to these entities in a way that it isn't actually open to our local authorities. So I do think that having a coherent view about, are we at scale that allows us to do interesting things? Have we thought about things that could be integrated and integrated effectively? And can we find resource? Can we actually work with, like for instance, we hear there's a flood of green finance coming our way. In fact, I actually believe what Mark Carney says about green finance, potentially. But how lined up are local authorities or community entities to get any of that money? Or will it all just go to corporate entities? So that I think there's a range of these things that, again, if it's a small group and they're focused on one thing, they're much less likely to make progress than if they have a broader agenda and have resource. I'm sorry if that seems pessimistic for some, but I do think that it's realistic.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned about our, our climate challenges, our climate crisis, as well as reducing biodiversity, because absolutely can community organisations play a role. And one of the things we're finding out, and I knew it, but we're doing it through a current call we're doing for case studies right now, is how community groups have a long history of doing carbon initiatives, whether that's around bikes and maintenance or growing spaces. And maybe just to let everybody know, we're doing a call for evidence for COP26, where we're going to be putting things together in a pavilion with the Chamber of Commerce, but that have been done by communities. So I think it's really interesting, that whole idea of them not being singular focused, to look at what other initiatives one could take on. So it's a role I'm hoping to play in EVOC. I'm just going to acknowledge that in the chat, there's quite a lot of discussion about housing, and really just to go over to Mike, from the co-housing group in Edinburgh. Mike Wilson, you've got a question about community link to housing. Over to Mike.
Hello and thank you. Yes, my name is Mike Wilson, and I'm convener of a co-housing group called Co-Housing in Southern Scotland. And I'm joined by the secretary of the group, David Somerville, who's also in the chat. And it was just to point out, I mean, this was contemporaneous to the actual presentation, that among several arguments still to be won, including at local authority level, is that co-housing is an authentic, realistic, deliverable housing model that places community at its heart. And I'm struck, and I said this in the chat, that with all this debate about the provision of affordable housing, there seems to be an assumption that communities will magically spring up around all that new housing. And I just don't believe that that will be the case. You need some sort of infrastructure to allow communities, to encourage people to buy in. And the co-housing model requires that of residents. They require a certain amount of volunteering. They require residents essentially to commit to the idea of being a good neighbour. So it's really just an appeal that if an appeal to encourage the development of co-housing projects. And as David will say, Choice is currently pursuing a property being sold by the City Council, and there's a deadline tomorrow for kind of responses to the likely recommendation that to the Housing and to the Finance and Resources Committee, sorry, at the council, that they take a bid that is not necessarily community, but is the highest financial bid, and you have to, I suppose, question to what extent community benefit is allowed to be part of the negotiation. Sorry, I've gone on.
No, Mike, that's incredibly helpful, and thank you for putting it in the chat. And I think it coincides for me with a point in your report, Duncan, where you talk about, through this group, over 4,500 people we've talked to, and constantly in webinars, there are a broad range of ideas from communities and individuals that we need to get before government about how we can do things differently. And I'm curious about your response on this one, on co-housing.
Well, I think Mike's absolutely right that you won't, just by funding an affordable housing project doesn't create a community. But what I would take you back, and what got me involved in this in 1974 when I started working, was the beginnings of community-based housing associations in Glasgow, usually in older areas in the city, in Partick and Elder Park and Denison and so on, and then later out after 1980 on the peripheral estates. These were entities where the committee were the community. They're actually the legal entity in Scots law at the time was a community-based association, had to have community-based committee members. And I saw with my own eyes, and later when I was in the board of Scottish Homes, you would go out to some really, really difficult neighbourhoods, and I know they exist in Edinburgh too, and you would find a community-led group, and usually it was the women. It was usually women, because the guys were doing something else. but it was usually women, were driving change and persuading ministers and persuading Scottish Government officials this was the right way to do it. And that actually pretty much held sway up until the early 2000s. I think that dynamic is less obvious in policy, and I think it should be right back up there. Different kinds of housing associations have come on the scene, but some of them are actually quite good at setting up tenant involvement groups, thinking about community. So I do think there are good examples, but there's also awful examples. When I came back from working in Canada to St Andrews University in 2008, I was astonished to see that there were some quite significant housing projects that had gone back to being produced, designed without community involvement. So involvement not only in the design but delivery of the service is important. On that point about financing and bid, the thing to do is say to Edinburgh City Council, are you in favour of inclusive growth? Are you in favour of community wealth? Are you in favour of what value do you place on these policies? Because if you place any value on these policies, it's not the highest bid. The highest bid is the beginning of the cycle of creating unaffordable housing. I'm sure you know that, but actually that's my point earlier, that the technocracy of these decisions needs to change so that the community benefit is part of the discussion alongside the private profit stuff. And that's where I think it's really important that community and voluntary sector don't see themselves as victims in this. You have to be the aggressors here because government have espoused your aims. So force them to actually take the values, because there are values in that, to put the values into the estimations. Sorry, and I feel quite passionately about the consistency of government.
It's wonderful to hear your passion. And I just want to say, please do put hands up or put it in the chat if there's any other questions that people want to ask. We've just got a few minutes to go. And I just want to acknowledge that, yes, we need to take our equal place. I deliberately am using the term third sector only occasionally now. I deliberately use the term community sector as much as possible, voluntary community sector and social enterprise, because often people will then realise it's the thing that's in their community. It's the thing that they might volunteer for. It's the thing with an Edinburgh postcode that they may fund as part of procurement or in the community wealth building space, rather than is third sector or are we equals at the table? And in particular, things like the Edinburgh Partnership. How can we really have that role there to help place creativity to the front and to the fore? So I'm open to questions from the floor or in terms of the chat. And I just want to acknowledge Susan Murray, who's been sharing information that is background to some of the report today, and to the David Hume Institute for a fantastic report. Some of the things in the report I think are very strong materials for you as organisations who represent organisations in terms of your business plans, funding applications, and arguments and discussions that you have with statutory partners, but also with us. How can we shift to place-based decision making and communities being involved in that? That's one of our big concerns at EVOC, and as some of you will know, our next event is going to be with Professor Donna Hall, who is one of those innovators who David refers to earlier, that is a innovator in England in terms of community capacity building and community decision making. So I'm really positive that actually these sort of themes can help you in terms of your development as organisations, and we're determined to bring some of those resources forward. So I'm conscious that maybe have we lost Duncan?
He's just moved around a little bit.
Just moved around. Oh, there we are. There, lovely. It's just the Zoom screen. So just to hear from Susan for a moment in the chat, you've been sharing with us, Susan, about how the report is deliberately not got jargon in, but accessible to people as something that they can use and working alongside people. Over to Susan. We've got. I'm not sure if Susan can hear me. That's okay. She maybe can't hear me. I think maybe she's, hopefully Susan will be back. So just want to acknowledge Susan's help in terms of the emphasis within this report as well. So as we finish up today, because we're coming up to 3:30, I want to say a huge thanks to Professor Duncan MacLennan in terms of actually an incredible report that I think many of you will use in your deliberations, whether that's at an organisational level or a policy level. It's a place that we want to come back to in terms of supporting place creativity. Duncan, a huge thanks. We want to wish you all the very best with your retirement as well. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. I'm retiring from being paid, but I'm not stopping working. Just to be clear.
Just to be totally clear, indeed, you will even greater autonomy to not be under a university banner and can say exactly what you feel, and you have today. Thank you for inspiring us and challenging us to be equal partners at a community planning level where the community voice should be heard. Thank you to all of you who've come today. I hope it's been a useful beginning to our series. Lots of stuff that will come after this in terms of Thriving Local. So a huge thank you to Duncan, a huge thank you to all of you, a big thank you to Esther and the EVOC team who made today possible. And I just want to say, Thriving Local, we're interested in speakers. Do send us ideas for speakers or for topics and we'll find the speaker. Let's think ahead, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next one, which is going to be Professor Donegal in August. All the very best, everybody. Thank you, Professor Duncan MacLennan. All the very best to everybody. Take care.